what in Latin is called a diuturni silenti, a long silence. That long moment of silence might be ending. But ironically, as we come into this new moment, a type of unprecedented crisis is upon us, what Karl Marx often called, again in Latin, a memento mori, a reminder of death. So in concluding and looking to the future, we're not trying to give a roadmap of what the future will look like. I don't think anybody would try to map the geography of the future. And that's because we are in a moment of uncertainty, and among masses of people, anxiety and fear. It is certain, however, that we're at the end of one epoch, the epoch of Europe, and the beginning of a new epoch, the epoch of humanity. Although, you know, all of these conversations have been a bit difficult for me, you know, preparing and trying to create an understandable narrative. This one is particularly difficult because the future is uncertain in its details and only vaguely clear. You know, while saying that, I would insist that without a sense and recognition that there is a future, and a future that we can fight for, and a future that we can win, we all descend into pessimism and nihilism, which would guarantee that we would not go forward but backward. There are a couple of things I want to kind of establish before, you know, we get to the real substance of what we're going to talk about. And I'd like to set up a historical set of benchmarks for American history, and within the framework of American history, to talk about the future as a manifestation of the thought and practice of thinkers like W.E.B Du Bois, Martin Luther King, and James Baldwin. I want to use in contextualizing and, as I would say more precisely, periodizing, organizing into periods American history. I'd like to use what is referred to as long wave theory. This is a theory, a set of theories generally applied to analysis of the economy, but I would like to use wave theory or long wave theory to establish the boundaries of different periods in American history. And I'm using waves of approximately 75 years. More or less, could be 1 or 2 years less, a few years more, but the periods that I'm thinking of and talking about are generally 75 years. So we're not talking about looking at this decade or that decade, but a wave, as it were. And so let me just establish them. The first goes from 1789, the founding of the American nation state with the ratification of the Constitution, and the institutionalization of a bourgeois democracy founded upon white supremacy and slavery. We can refer to that as an Ehrenvolk democracy. Ehrenvolk is a German word meaning master race democracy. From 1789 to 1863, which is the Emancipation Proclamation and the declaration that slavery was no longer legal, and this kicked off the beginning of the full participation of the enslaved Africans in the war to end slavery, and leading to 165 or more thousand blacks in the Union Army, and what Du Bois would call the general strike of the slaves, involving somewhere close to 500,000 who ceased to work. The second period is the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War II. Let us say 1865 to 1940. If you'd like, we could stretch it to the end of World War II, 1945. This is a catastrophic period for world capitalism, almost leading to the collapse of world capitalism. You have two world wars, World War I, 1914 to 1918, World War II, 1939 to 1945, and in between these two great wars, the most devastating wars in human history, is the Great Depression, the greatest economic collapse in the history of capitalism. And then the final period, which takes us to the present moment, is 1945 to 2020. This is the period of US hegemony. The dollar becomes hegemonic in world financial and trading relationships, and the US military becomes the largest and most powerful military in human history to enforce upon the world a US empire that is the largest in human history, but does not look like empires of the past, be they the Roman Empire or the British Empire or others. It is a wholly new type of empire. The other thing I should add is that in this period, the US state becomes the largest, most powerful, most sophisticated state in human history. This is not inconsequential as we go forward. Also, this is the period where the center of world history shifts now to the anti-colonial struggle, and in the United States, the Black freedom movement. I will return to these periods, but I just want to establish some sense of historical boundaries and historical context. A term that I want to introduce into the discussion today, a concept called epistemic rupture. Epistemic, E-P-I-S-T-E-M-I-C, rupture. Episteme or epistemic refers to all of that which has to do with knowledge and knowledge diffusion, knowledge production, theories of knowledge, and the histories of knowledge. A rupture is a break. It could also refer to a overturning. So when we talk about, in this context that we're going to be talking, an epistemic rupture, we're talking about a major break with the philosophical and ideological past, and a new world outlook taking its place. Now, let's just go back a bit to some of the things that we have looked at in the past. While we've talked about, the major philosophers, or some of the major philosophers from Descartes to Lenin, going through Kant and Hegel and so on, even up to existentialism, we have not yet attempted to summarize the foundational assumptions of Western philosophy. And I'd like to kind of do that right now. When I say foundational assumptions, there are a set of values, we can call them assumptions, that tie all of modern Western philosophy together. And assumptions that are essential to Western philosophy, but also are its fundamental flaw. To use the words of Karl Marx, the seeds of its own destruction inherent in the essence of the thing itself. And what is that? It is the assumption that white supremacy is normal and natural, that the racial division of the world is the normal state of humanity. This assumption then undergirds what we would call a white supremacist worldview or ideology, which informs everything else that is done. So therefore, when Frantz Fanon, in his writings, for example, Wretched of the Earth, talks about the crisis of European man, or the other side of it, connected to that, the crisis of European reason, he is talking about, among other things, the crisis of the assumptions, especially the assumption of white supremacy that undergirds all of modern Western philosophy. Now, the epoch that begins in 1865, while we are still in the period of the ascendancy of Western society, Western civilization, and Western capitalism, we are going from its stage, especially in the United States, of manufacturing and enterprises that have not yet become huge monopolies, where banks are not dominant over manufacturing, to a stage where the economy is controlled by large corporations that themselves are controlled by banks and financial institutions. It's kind of the financialization and the monopolization of the US economy. It is what Rudolf Hilferding, the German social democrat, and Lenin would call finance capital, and Lenin's term, imperialism. The system then reaches beyond national boundaries to become an international system, a global system. In fact, to offset economic contractions and depressions, the world, especially the Afro-Asiatic and Latin American worlds, become a source of cheap labor and maximum profit. The system is stabilized, both in the sense of the class conflict and the sense of avoiding deep depressions, by the existence of colonized labor, which is super exploited, producing unbelievable profits and making commodities cheaper for the working class, the middle class, and others in the major capitalist societies. So imperialism emerges, not so much as a natural and inevitable thing, but as a response to the varying crisis of capitalism. But it is at this very time, and this is after the emancipation of enslaved labor and its gradual transformation into a proletariat, albeit super exploited and existing in conditions of labor not that far removed from slavery, segregated and marginalized in the former slave states of the South. You know, it's a very interesting, and when you look at the architecture of this, one can only conclude that once liberated from chattel slavery, they were only forced back into a condition almost like chattel slavery, but called something different, the illusion of freedom, but a system now of even more intensive exploitation and producing greater profits. So this new system in the South is more profitable than slavery was. It is at this time that a Black intelligentsia begins to emerge. And its foremost representative, and there's several of them, Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Alexander Crummell, we could name many of them. But the one whose unique mind makes him outstanding is W.E.B. Du Bois. No one could have seen him coming. How could you? He was born in Massachusetts in a town called Great Barrington in Western Massachusetts. He was the only Black kid in his school. He did not talk like most Black people. He talked with a New England accent. He never knew his father. He was raised by his mother and his maternal, the maternal side of his family. But he was a well-adjusted kid. He faces his first encounter with racism, as he says in The Souls of Black Folk, when I think he was about 12 years old. And a young Irish girl who had just come to the school refused to take his greeting cards, and all the kids were giving each other greeting cards. And he said it was not just the refusal, but the way it was done. And as he said, he called it the glance, the racial glance, you know, which most of us who are experiencing this racist thing know what that is. He says she rejected him peremptorily. And he said after that, he decided that he did not want to ever beg to be admitted into their community. He only wanted to be better than they at sports and at schoolwork. And he says, and if I couldn't do that, I wanted to be able to beat their heads. It is such an interesting moment in the biography of the thinker who, in my estimate, became the greatest philosopher in the 20th century in the Euro-American world. But it was that event that he says saved him from descending into pessimism, nihilism, and self-destructive behavior. The sense that I will fight for my dignity, I will fight for my humanity, and in so doing, I will fight for the dignity and humanity of all of my people. Now, okay, so he graduates from high school, and his mother dies right at the moment of his graduation, a few weeks after his graduation. So he is without a mother and a father. He has to work a year before he can go to college. He's from Massachusetts. He wants to go to Harvard. Harvard is not accepting anybody from his town, which is a town of poor working people, and they're not accepting, I don't think at this time, any blacks. So he decides to go south and to Fisk University. He will always say that Fisk was as good as Harvard. The professors were as good as the ones that he would meet at Harvard in graduate school. The only difference is they weren't as well known. And he would say of Harvard, when he finally gets there, that he was at Harvard and not of Harvard. But he was a Fisk. Fisk is in Nashville, Tennessee. It's spelled F-I-S-K. Fisk was a colonel in the Union Army. Fisk was one of the first, the earliest of what we today call historically Black colleges and universities. Going forward, Du Bois would become a champion of Black colleges and universities, and even insisting that Black young people who go to college should first go to a Black college, and if they wanted to go to professional or graduate school, then they could consider a white college. But the Black colleges would be what Harvard is to the nation. They would be that to the Black nation. But he goes to Fisk, he studies philosophy, he graduates in 3 years, and he's admitted to Harvard. At Harvard, he lives within the folds of the Black community in Cambridge, in Boston, Massachusetts, by the way. And he wants to be a part of the Glee Club. He loves to sing, but he can't because he's Black. I don't guess he wanted to join one of their sororities, but he lived with the fact that he was separate. Now, when he's admitted to Harvard to graduate school, but they say to him he has to redo his undergraduate degree, which he does. But he goes on to complete his dissertation. It is published, and so on. I won't go into all the details. But immediately, there is something driving him to use knowledge as an instrument of liberation. He is aware that his group, as he called Black people, were in need of intellectual, philosophical, and ideological leadership, as well as skills, etc. So he's a big advocate throughout his life of those schools, those colleges, which have what they call a liberal education, where students at them would get the same education as white students at elite universities. The only thing is that these universities, he hoped, the Black universities, would prepare their graduates for service to the Black community. That would not always be the case. But then by 1903, he's come to Philadelphia. He's written The Philadelphia Negro. It's published by that time. No white university will hire him. So he goes to Atlanta, to what was then Atlanta University. Atlanta University is a university primarily in name. And so he goes with the intent of setting up a department of sociology, setting up a sociological laboratory, and continuing and taking to a new level what had been going on at Atlanta, and that was an annual conference. So Du Bois, while he is at at Atlanta University, he does what is not being done in sociology anywhere in the country. And he has this 100-year plan. Every 10 years, they would study a set of issues in the Black community: the Black educated person, the Black business person, the Black laborer, the Black peasant. 10 studies in 10 years. And then the next 10 years, they would return and study those same things to see where we had come and where we were since they first started, you know? And then, but his sociology department, he has this idea that he could produce objective empirical knowledge unfettered by white racism, and that Atlanta was a place to do this. Well, and then the third thing, the laboratory, where he would train sociologists to continue the work of investigating and studying the Black community. But at the same time, he's looking at the world beyond Atlanta. In 1900, he will attend the first Pan-African conference held in London. And he will give a speech there in 1900, where among other things, he makes the pronouncement that now resonates throughout American history and in some ways throughout the world. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. In some ways, he meant it as the problem of democracy and humanity was the problem of the 20th century. Both the legal legal proscriptions of Black people in this country without the right to vote. You know, he's aware that 4 years earlier, the Supreme Court had ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that inequality was legal under the Constitution, and in fact went further, not proclaiming, but kind of saying that whiteness is property. And, you know, the American Constitution prides itself on the protection of property. By saying that whiteness is property, was literally accepting the doctrine that whiteness must be protected, that Black rights need not be protected. He is aware of all of this. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. In philosophical terms and in the trajectory of his intellectual life, this would mean that what was considered normal in Europe and in white philosophy, that is a racial hierarchy, racial inequality, and white supremacy, Du Bois is now beginning to understand, or to assert, I should say, that white supremacy and the color line were abnormal, ultimately a problem. The word problem means a lot more to his body of thinking and writing than it might mean to us. By problem, he meant a crisis. The color line, as he would metaphorically call it, produces a crisis for democracy and a crisis for humanity. As if, to confirm what he was saying, 30 years after the publication of The Souls of Black Folk, where he repeats this, Hitler comes to power in Germany on a platform of racial supremacy, extreme racial supremacy, and even racial genocide. But by 2003, Du Bois publishes the landmark, and here I wish to make it clear, the landmark philosophical text of the 20th century. By landmark, I don't mean the final, but the start. And it is The Souls of Black Folk. And I say it is landmark not because it answers all of the questions of his time or ours, but it posed the fundamental questions that philosophy should deal with, and if it were to be worth anything, would deal with. Now, he does a lot of things in the souls of Black folk. He introduces a number of concepts. Already we've said the color line. But then he would speak in metaphors. The color line itself is a metaphor. But then, which is a metaphor for racial division, racial hierarchy, racial inequality, racial predation, lynching, and so on. It's not just an inactive, sometimes people would say, an inactive fence separating the races. No. What he was talking about is a social system of racial inequality, racial violence, etc. He metaphorically refers to it as a color line. He would also metaphorically talk of this racial system in terms of the consciousness that it produces. And he would use another metaphor, the veil. The veil is, very, very much known to many cultures in world society. For example, in Islamic societies, the veil covers the face of females, certain Muslim societies. And one of the things we know about the veil, in this sense, is that the woman can see out, but men cannot see in. And that kind of aptly describes a part of the racial dynamic in American society. Black folks see white people, but up to this day, for the most part, Black folk in our essence are invisible to most white people. I mean, there's certain language that makes people appear to know or to see. Everybody can say the word white supremacy. But what about the Black people, the Black proletariat? I mean, we just saw recently in the Bernie Sanders campaign, talked about this yesterday, where the Black masses were for the most part invisible to Bernie Sanders. But then Du Bois, as he says, goes within the veil. He would, on the Black side, he would often refer to Black people as a nation within a nation. He goes to this nation within a nation, and then he talks about consciousness. And this is very interesting because he talks about white consciousness as one way. White consciousness, for the most part, sees reality only through itself. Whiteness is the final reference for white folk. All things are judged on the basis of this egotism, this narcissism, this selfishness, this self-centeredness that is produced by whiteness. But Black folk, he says two things about Black consciousness. And here I think we see an epistemic break of monumental significance. Remember that all of modern Western philosophy is overdetermined by an attempt to understand the mind. Sometimes they would say the spirit, but it is to understand consciousness. And ultimately, what could be known by conscious feeling or sentient beings? What could be known? A single consciousness. Du Bois talks about a double consciousness. He splits it. The world is split racially. The oppressor cannot see the oppressed. The oppressor groups only see the world through themselves. But the oppressed, especially Blacks in the United States, see the world in twos, judge phenomenon in twos. They see the world through the eyes of the white oppressor but then they see the world through their own identity. So there are not just two consciousnesses, but two references, at least two references. You know, seeing through the reference point of whiteness, which we do quite well, to be very honest about it, and seeing the world through the reference that is you, that is your history. Now, in an oppressive society, the oppressed will usually and often defer to the oppressor side of the double consciousness. And only in times of great upheaval will the ultimate reference become the oppressed, him or herself. But then Du Bois offers another way of thinking about this, and that is the what he calls double vision. This is a huge thing. I think it is foundational, especially in understanding Black art, Black music, Black literature, using European instruments and European notations and other things that are essentially European, but transforming, kind of turning the whole thing upside down, creating a rupture within the established music or the established art or the established literature. A rupture from within because of the double vision. I would like to also just put about the souls of Black folk. The title itself is transgressive. When Du Bois used the word souls, he is pretty much using a word that, when used in the German, for instance, by Hegel, would mean spirit or mind. He's not talking about soul food or soul music, you know. He's talking about the mind of Black folk. Well, already he's being transgressive. The idea that Black people had a soul was a challenge to normal white thinking and philosophy of the time. That Black folk had consciousness, that Black folk reflected, that Black folk could know, was completely ludicrous to much of the white world. In fact, what was being argued in the United States is that Black people did not deserve citizenship or civil rights or the right to vote, because being uncivilized, we would destroy civilization. And the white South, even up in many quarters up till today, but certainly up to the time of the civil rights movement, was so violent against the civil rights protesters because they believed that they were upsetting a civilized way of life in the interest of barbarism and uncivilization or non-civilization. Du Bois would also assert in an earlier essay that Black folk were not only conscious, not only had minds, not only could know, but that Black folk were a civilization in potentiality. This is quite deep. I would make the argument that the trajectory has been that now we are a civilization in actuality. And when we get to Du Bois's novel that we talked about yesterday, Dark Princess, in a certain way, in a very active way, I should say, Du Bois works out this whole idea of Black folk as a civilization. Okay, that's the souls of Black folk. But let me just say, I just want to go quickly through Du Bois, and I would just put these on the table. He proceeds from the notion of the color line, a world divided along race. The racial color line would take one form in the United States, it would take another form in India and Africa. That colonialism was a manifestation of the color line. That the color line united the darker races against Europe, objectively and subjectively. That Du Bois, in order to carry out the anti-colonial liberatory project in philosophy that he did, he would have to reconceptualize history. And he does it in a way that's often breathtaking. And at the heart of his philosophy of history is the very opposite of Hegel's. That in the movement of world spirit, Hegel would argue, Africa does not take a part. The movement of spirit and consciousness throughout history is a movement of civilized people. And Africans had not risen much above barbarism and much above animal life. Du Bois makes the fundamentally opposite argument that Africa, going back to the most ancient of times, is the pivot upon which all world history moves. That from Africa, many things come. He would use the phrase of a Roman senator. Always Africa is giving the world something new, or a metapsychosis of a world-old thing. That Africa, both as the origins of modern human beings, the modern human type, but also the origin of civilization. And throughout his work, be it when he talks about the equality of women in the famous essay, The Damnation of Women, or when he talks in his histories of Africa, especially the final one, The World in Africa, it is always Africa that is giving the world new things in religion, in art, in music. That Africa sits in many ways at the geographic center of the world and is in effect, in fact, the center of the world. And that Africans have explored and settled parts of the world in what we today call Latin America and as far east as Vietnam, Cambodia, and China, not to mention India, which is the consort in many ways of Africa. He reconstructs history. So it's not just a civil rights or even human rights or legal political struggle, but he takes the color line on at every one of its foundations, and especially the writing of history that privileges Europe and whiteness and demeans Africa and blackness. He would, another aspect of his work is the question of time. Now, time as a category is fundamental to the three thinkers that we're talking about, to King, to Baldwin, and to Du Bois. It would seem to me that it is natural in a philosophical and ideological sense that in a liberatory project, Black thinkers would have to engage time in a critical way. The critical way that Du Bois deals with time is to make it not an absolute, but a relative and fluid category that shapes, reshapes, organizes, reorganizes consciousness and knowledge. Martin Luther King, by the way, just to leap ahead for a moment, would refer to the tragic misconception of time, the idea that time solves every problem, and thus the oppressed should wait on time. Du Bois has a similar concept, that the time as conceptualized by the oppressor and time conceptualized by the oppressed of necessity must be different. If you recall, when we talked about Kant said that the two a priori conditions, that is before experience, the two before experience concepts that exist in our human reasoning are space and time. But time is what we're talking about now. Time was fixed, was static, was one thing. Du Bois loosens time or separates time from the static to the possibility of fluidity. Now, Kant saw philosophy as a handmaiden or tool to science, natural science. Du Bois saw philosophy as most intimately connected to solving human problems and thus to humanity. He would therefore not naturalize, or I don't want to say natural, but he would not want to use time in the static sense as an aid to scientific explanation. He uses it in the human sense as fluid, as not fixed, and that he even implies that time would take on different meanings, different conceptions, and different uses and functions from culture to culture, from civilization to civilization. You'll find this in King, and ultimately you find it in Baldwin. The other thing, and I want to go quickly, I'm not taking too much time, logic, Du Bois and logic. When we talked about Hegel, we talked about the science of logic and the dialectic, that all things exist in a state of motion. What gives movement to things is that they all consist of a unity of opposites, of two things that are opposite. And that struggle and that conflict or that struggle produces motion. Du Bois talks about logic, not talks about it, but demonstrates it, at least in history, in his Black Reconstruction in America. Marx takes Hegel's dialectic and applies it to the class conflict. But there are two, it's the binary. From Hegel gets a binary sense of logic from Aristotle. What Du Bois does in looking at history and class in America, especially, and this could be applied on a global scale, that rather than a binary, it is a trilogy, it's three. It's a kind of a thing that I refer to, which is ambiguous the way I stated, but I wish I could do it better. It's a dialectic through threes rather than through twos. And so he talks, as he sets up Black Reconstruction, which is a study in the class conflict in the United States. He begins with the Black worker, which he will ultimately in the text refer to as the Black Proletariat. It is then the white worker, and then he talks about the planter, but we can call that the bourgeoisie, the capitalist. But in this project of historical logic, to make it work in the framework of class and the color line, a category previously unrecognized and unacknowledged, in social and historical studies he discovers, and that is the category of the Black Proletariat. This Black proletariat is at one and the same time the most oppressed section of the American working class, but at the same time, it has a gravitational tendency towards the working class and peasantry of the darker nations. It is both integrated into the working class of the United States, but integrated as the most exploited, oppressed, and underprivileged part of the working class. Its oppression is participated in by white workers whose identity is tied up with whiteness. Part of that, but also part of a larger world movement, producing a logic which is dialectical, but not dialectical in a binary sense, but in a trilogy sense, dialectics through threes. I think that in this logical sense, that not only does Du Bois anticipate developments within natural science, which does not proceed, for instance, quantum mechanics, cannot be understood in binary terms. It is more fluid than that. There are more variables than just twos. But also our ways of understanding complexity in social systems. The final thing, just in the philosophical sense, is Du Bois and the state. The color line racializes society and racializes the state. That's from the beginning of American history. It becomes more crystallized as we go forward. But then there's something that I've seldom talked about, and I've just begun to understand it in the works of Du Bois, is that Du Bois, and we see it in The Dark Princess, in the discussion between Matthew and Princess Catilia over dictatorship of the proletariat. Du Bois is suggesting in a very subtle and not yet fully developed sense a civilization state. But more than a civilization state that references the ancient past solely, but a civilizational state, and here's where I'm going to formulate it, a civilization state of the whole people. Now, you know, in India, Modi, the prime minister, is trying to develop a Hindu state. But that is not what Du Bois is talking about. He is talking about what, in a lot of ways, is a 21st century project, in some ways being developed or experimented with in China, and that is a civilizational state of the whole people, a civilizational state that undermines inequality, etc. Let me just conclude with Du Bois on this. As I said, I think Du Bois, according to how you define philosophy and the function of philosophy, could be considered the greatest philosopher of the 20th century and perhaps of the 21st century. His philosophy and all of his scholarship and thinking and writing is from the front line and deep in the trenches of struggle for freedom. He therefore looks at philosophy, looks at theories, he looks at ideology from the standpoint of how they advance the struggle for freedom against white supremacy and against colonialism. It is a liberation philosophy. In that sense, it is the opposite of postmodern philosophy, which is a quintessential academic project which is, does not take a position for freedom. Certainly, the practitioners of academic and postmodern philosophy do not actively engage in the struggle for freedom. This sense of philosophy as an active force in the struggle for freedom would define both Martin Luther King and Jimmy Baldwin's approach. For King, I think the works, and there are many works that we could reference with respect to King. His body of work is both rich in a literary sense, but even richer in a philosophical sense. The great question for King is the moral question. The moral question is a historical question as well. And it begins with the question, what side of history do you stand on? And for King, the most immoral position is the hypocritical position that says you're for democracy and liberty and freedom, but says at the same time to the oppressed, you can't move too quickly. You have to let time solve all of these problems. When King uses, as he does in the letter from a Birmingham jail, when he uses the concept of the fierce urgency of now, and he connects that to the phrase, we are all wrapped in a single garment of destiny, he is saying that the fate of humanity is not something we can push off to a later date. It's not something that history and time will solve. It will only be the active and willful, purposeful action of people that will solve problems that have been created by systems and individuals. It is, as a philosopher of the moral imperative, that King, when combined with Du Bois, becomes a powerful framing of what philosophy is and what philosophers must do. You might remember, and this is not in King, it is that for King, it is that philosophy can be active in the lives of people. And as such, individuals become philosophers because individuals, in the course of activity to transform the world, engage in discourse among themselves and with people who they are not acquainted with about the great moral questions inspiring struggles for freedom and transformation. And in that sense, each person, especially if she or he is active in transforming the world, becomes a philosopher and is as significant as a philosopher as those academics who write books and do nothing. But here's where Du Bois gives us something so mind-blowing. It's, how could you say, I mean, how to imagine it. He talks about the philosopher proletarian, the proletarian who is also a philosopher. And he talks, and this is from A Dark Princess, about those who work must be the thinkers, and those who think must be workers. This is literally unknown in Western philosophy. The philosopher is disengaged and removed from the masses. The geniuses are geniuses because they're not involved with people, because they're not advocates of the people, because they don't work. Du Bois says the opposite. He said it is a catastrophe when those who work are not thinkers. The contradiction of thought and action, of thinkers and the working class, is resolved by Du Bois when the proletarian becomes the philosopher, and when the philosopher is a proletarian. For King, and really also for James Lawson, we saw when he was here, that the huge questions of humanity become philosophical questions involved with humanity when the ordinary woman and man, in action to transform society, define discourses about ethics, morality, knowledge, history of ideas, and on and on. Questions that are usually selfishly protected by academics are now thrown wide open and become the property of ordinary people. That's a beautiful thought. Now, Jimmy Baldwin, and so I think King's, just a few more things, King's concept of the moral world, the beloved community, is a community where people love, but to reach that stage, each woman and man must be a philosopher of the moral imperative, must embrace as his or her property ownership of the great questions of humanity. Western philosophy had no love for or confidence in the ordinary person. Now, Baldwin. Baldwin is extraordinary. Like King and Du Bois, he does philosophy from a position of a freedom fighter, and not a freedom fighter thinking about freedom, but a freedom fighter actively involved in liberation. In an essay entitled "Take Me to the Water," he said he was in Paris thinking about, and to a certain extent involved in solidarity with the Algerian revolutionary freedom fighters. And he went to this conference that he wrote about, that we talked about, on African writers and artists. And while he is there, he's hearing about not only Emmett Till, but also about, who was a 14-year-old kid killed by white men. But he's also hearing about the freedom movements, the protests, the sacrifice. And for him, the price of the ticket to speak on Blackness and Black issues, the price one had to pay was to be involved in that struggle. Isn't it interesting? No involvement, no authority to speak. The very opposite of academic knowledge. Most academics are authorized by institutions that are antithetical to the freedom of people, be they people fighting against colonialism, those fighting against economic exploitation, those fighting against racial oppression. You see? The authorization of speech, the authorization to be heard, in a situation of a powerful division of society, and one like we're living in, you are authorized to do those things from those who rule. What Baldwin says is the authority to speak comes with one's willingness to sacrifice and struggle. That's the price of the ticket. On the other side, the bourgeois academic does not have to pay a price. Maybe they do. Maybe the price is to be loyal to the state. Maybe the price is to obscure the true essence of oppression. The price is to sell your soul to the slave owner, to the colonialist. You write a book which obscures the nature of racial oppression. Big academic institutions will run to you and say, we want you to set up an institution and we'll fund you to do research to prove that Black people are the problem. What does Baldwin say? He says, we don't have a Negro problem in the United States. We have a white problem in the United States. Now that is a very important philosophical move. Remember that the undergirding of Western philosophy is the assumption of white supremacy. It normalizes white supremacy and whiteness. What does Baldwin do? Extending Du Bois's notion of the color line and whiteness, he says there is not a Negro problem, it is a white problem. Now, all of this occurs, or much of it occurs, after the three events that we talked about. Capitalism barely survived World Wars I and II and the Great Depression. Barely survived. But what is the backup? It is the US economy, untouched for the most part by World War II, untouched by World War I, the strongest economy maybe in history, and the currency that governs world trade and finance. It saves capitalism, but it saves capitalism on terms that are quintessentially American. White supremacy and anti-communism, or the same as anti-revolutionism. It comes to the defense of the white world in order not only to save the white world, but to do it on American terms. So every struggle for freedom is, in the end, a struggle against white supremacy. Every struggle for freedom, no matter where it is in the world, intersects with the struggle for Black freedom in the United States. And they all of the great thinkers, the philosophers, knew this. They say that whiteness is abnormal, that's Baldwin in particular. That freedom, that cherished concept hypocritically embraced by the white bourgeoisie, that freedom means something different than civil liberties or even civil rights. That freedom means freedom from oppression in all of its forms. That is itself a philosophical problem and issue to be addressed in philosophy, but from the standpoint of the people. Angela Davis is one who explores that notion very deeply and in a very profound philosophical sense. It is not the freedom that Marcuse is talking about, which is anchored to, in a certain sense, to Freudian psychology. It is not the freedom that comes, like the hippies back in the day with LSD and other drugs. It is not to free the individual, but it is the freedom of the people. I'll end on this, and I'm sorry if I spoke too long. I know I did. I think, Johan, the future, and here we're talking about the future in the sense of philosophy, ideology, and ideas. The future is not with the European modern philosophical tradition. That tradition has offered much to human civilization, and its footprint in world civilization is huge. But it is the past. And thus, we are at that moment of a negation of a negation. We're at that moment of the loosening of the hold that Western ideas have had upon humanity. We're at that stage because the crisis of European man, to use the language of Frantz Fanon, is a crisis of Western civilization. And in this period where we're moving from the age of Europe to the age of humanity, hopefully to the age of a beloved community, or again, as King talked about, a world house. If we're moving from Europe, as King said in his pilgrimage to nonviolence, from Western philosophy, which assumes white supremacy and violence and war and colonialism, that we move to all philosophies in the world, including the great philosophers of this country, the African-American thinkers we mentioned. As we move there, we can fight to transform philosophy and to create new ideologies and a new purpose for human thought. I'll stop there.
All right. Very gripping exposition from the stages of history, or the cycles of history, as it were, all the way to the philosophers and the crisis that philosophy is facing in our time. So I would like to invite all of our viewers to, they might need a few minutes to think about everything that's been discussed, but to please share their comments, questions, reactions for Dr. Monteiro on the topics we've been discussing today. There are already a few people that are just saying how much they appreciate these lectures. We're hearing from Bai Haki Youssef. He says hi from Brunei. Susan Reardon says thank you, Tony, for always teaching me something new.
Who is that?
Susan Reardon.
Oh, Susan, yeah.
Yeah, I think she works with Jed Dodd.
Yeah.
And Nzinga Reed says thank you. Renee McKenzie, Pastor Renee McKenzie says thank you, Dr. Monteiro. So we have a great crowd today. I would also like to invite all those people to share their comments and reactions, since they've enjoyed this so far.
I apologize to Pastor Renee for not mentioning the philosophers she always talks about. Emmanuel Elie, he was the collaborator with Husserl. I didn't mention him. I'm sorry, Renee.
Maybe she can mention him and follow up. But there's a lot of things. Christina Jackson also says thank you. But there's a lot of points that I think we can go that we can discuss further because it's been a very rich presentation. But I'd like to maybe start at the beginning of your presentation when you were discussing these waves of history. And it's very interesting that we're talking about history. We've titled this series of lectures Philosophy, Ideology, and History, because we're trying to keep the three together. We're trying to keep history in conversation with philosophy, whereas the tendency in academia is to separate the two. And this concept of the cycles of history is something which we don't learn very much in academic history. The tendency, as you were saying, is to focus on, at most, the decade, maybe 2 decades of history. But you're talking about these long cycles. Yes. And we're talking about the philosophies that emerge in these long cycles. Yeah. And essentially, it seems that the 3 major philosophers we talked about today, King, Du Bois, Baldwin, well, Du Bois is basically born in the cycle that begins in 1865 and ends, but he lives through the world wars and lives into the beginning of the final cycle, which you identified, 1945 to 2020, whereas King and Baldwin primarily are living in this and active in this final cycle, 1945 to 2020. But I wanted to ask you, if we could further expand this final cycle of history, because it seems to me that in some ways we can further divide 1945 and 2020 perhaps into 2 sections. 1945, which, as you were saying, marks the beginning of the Cold War and also the beginning of this great anti-colonial upsurge, I think all the way until the fall of the Eastern Socialist Bloc in the early 1990s, I think is one sort of stage in which there were a lot of possibilities. As you were saying, all this African-American militancy, the civil rights movement was very active in that period. U.S. imperialism was facing a great challenge, both from Eastern European socialism, but also this great anti-colonial movement all across Africa and Asia. But that, as we've discussed before, ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we entered this new phase, which most of us, many of our younger viewers who are watching, and myself included, were born at the time that period sort of ended. And we started this new, perhaps we can call a special period from roughly 1991, perhaps until 2016. And with the events that have happened since 2016, we've seen, as you are identifying, a new, perhaps epistemological rupture, a new crisis of Western philosophy. I mean, I know that since 2016, you've been, at least I've been hearing you discuss this concept of the end of the Western world order, or the beginning of, at least, of the end of the Western world order, and the process of a new becoming, a becoming of an age of humanity in which all these questions will be on the table. So I wanted to ask you what you thought about that, especially looking at the past 2016 until now as sort of a new stage, a new period. And how do you see these philosophies, particularly the work we've been doing with the free school, in the context of that period?
Yeah. I think that's a very complex. I do agree with what you're saying, that within each wave there are periods that can be identified. One of the things I just wanted to establish, by the way, I think one of the most important books that people of your generation and of mine can kind of look at and study is Dark Princess. I know it's the most favorite book of the free school. And the reason I say that is that it's a philosophical novel. And it's a philosophical novel very much like Plato's Republic. Plato does philosophy in this dialogic encounter between Socrates and an interrogator, and not so much an interrogator as a partner in discourse. And that's what you get with this book, but it's philosophical. And I was trying to establish this last period where the center of world history unquestionably shifts to the darker races. Now, that doesn't mean that European imperialism is still not hegemonic, but the driving force, the principal aspect of the contradiction is now the darker nations. And as such, and this really is such an interesting thing that Du Bois develops as a theory of history, as such, in Dark Princes, he says that Asia and Africa can be encountered in the black belt of the South. That the Black Proletariat, as I mentioned before, is as much, if not more so, a part of the movements against colonialism. And I think if we, look at them, especially in the middle of the 20th century, they look more like the anti-colonial struggle than they do look like the, and I put quotes, the class struggle, as conceptualized in the European framework. But that's what I want. But for you all who did not experience that earlier era, but experienced what was an aggressive counter-revolution with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was itself a counter-revolution from within, which threw into disarray and chaos the world movement. Africa has been most impacted by the collapse of the Soviet Union because it then allows for a new form of neo-colonialism to take over Africa. And that's what we're experiencing today, throwing Africa back several decades, in many ways, back to a condition before independence. And I'm prepared to argue that the leadership of the earlier period is so outstanding that you take North Korea, which is a highly evolved society, or the Korean Peninsula itself. Neither North or South Korea was on the level of many African countries economically and politically. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a vicious attack, a racist attack upon Africa to establish a new neo-colonialism, and that is throughout the continent. But then, as powerful as the West was, they couldn't do it all. So that now you have China and Asia, and of course, the possibility of a new unity of Pan-Africa and Pan-Asia. I would say for your generation, it is not just philosophies that have been written or philosophies that are embraced in the academies. Today we hear so much of Foucault and Nietzsche and Derrida and queer philosophy and so on. But for your generation, it is, I think, critical to advance philosophy in the ways that Du Bois, or to study philosophy in the ways that Du Bois and King and Baldwin did. And I think that for your generation, those interested in philosophy and theory and social change, there is no thinker, just as a thinker, more important than W.E.B. Du Bois. But when he is combined with King and with Baldwin, and the concept of the proletarian philosopher, those who work must be those who think, it gives you a way to think about the future and to theorize how to move forward. And it does give you a way to address all of the chaos and anarchism that attempts to take over movements from the standpoint of identity politics, which is a form of nihilism and pessimism. It gives you the model for how to think about the future and how to execute it, while at the same time advancing the philosophical, theoretical questions that are necessary to advance practice.
Right. Well, Dark Princess remains essential for the free school, and I think we're discover, even I think, guess 2 or 3 years into reading it, we're discovering new angles which we hadn't previously seen. So we have some questions, some comments. Brian Jones says, brilliant, Dr. Monteiro, consciousness opening, soul bending. So,
well, he's a good friend of mine.
Getting to the soul.
Be transparent.
Okay, but we have a question from Brandon's two-part question from Brandon Stanford. This says, Doc, you are the man. Thanks for that all too important and profound lecture at this moment of history. I have two questions that I'd just like for you to elaborate on more for the free school and the viewers. Number one, Du Bois stated the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Reinterpreting his statement today, is he suggesting that the color line has created a crisis of the human future? And is that crisis one of whiteness? Number two, in Du Bois's magnum opus, he talks about the public and psychological wages of whiteness. Could you speak to this wages of whiteness, its conceptualization and socio-historical history, and how it applies to us today in this moment, in this crisis?
Could you, the first question, just summarize again? I want to get that.
Sure, okay. He says, Du Bois stated the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Reinterpreting his statement today, is he suggesting that the color line has created a crisis of the human future?
Yeah.
And is that crisis one of whiteness?
Absolutely. And I think that's the conclusion that he increasingly came to. That the color line is antithetical to humanity itself. By the time he gets to the post-World War II and to the Cold War, he is a preeminent fighter for peace. But he had already asserted at the first Pan-African Congress in Paris in 1919 that there could not be a lasting peace as long as there were colonies. You know what I'm saying? So the Pan-African movement was also a pro-peace movement because, you know, Woodrow Wilson and the Allied leaders who met in Paris were attempting through the League of Nations and Wilson's 14 points to establish an enduring peace among the, quote, great powers, which meant the white powers. And Du Bois, meeting on the other side of town, asserts that without an end to colonialism and the development of democracy and the abolition of the color line, there could not be enduring peace. And thus, 20 years after he makes that statement, World War II breaks out. And World War II is again about colonies, about white supremacy, and about imperialism, the most devastating, destructive war in human history. In the 21st century, that same, as Brandon Stanford said, I agree with you, Brandon, that same problem of war and peace and racism are upon us. Colonialism has not gone away. It has just taken a different form. White supremacy has not gone away. It's just taken a different form. As to that last part of your question, whiteness, and a wage for whiteness, a psychological wage that seduces the white worker away from the black worker and forces the black proletariat towards the third world, towards the anti-colonial struggle. You know, you could see it, for example, with Muhammad Ali. You know, reviled, hated in the United States by the majority of whites. Where does he turn? To the darker nations. And he is embraced and loved because they see in him a fighter not only for his own people, but for the Vietnamese people, for the people of India, for Africa. Because to fight against the white supremacy of US imperialism, which is the color line, is also to fight for the freedom of colonized peoples. So we, as African Americans, are inevitably pushed towards the darker world. We are forced to be internationalists. We are forced to be inter-civilizational. And we are forced to open our arms and hearts to all who fight for freedom. If I could just say, and thus it is, the further extension of the wage for whiteness in Baldwin, that, see that mirror, where the white man cannot see himself. You know what I'm saying? And that is a key to white privilege. I don't want to really look at myself because myself is normal. There's nothing to interrogate. There's nothing to investigate. So that's what I would say, Jahan. I hope that was clear.
All right. Related to that, we have another question from Marcos Tejeda. I hope I'm saying that right. He says, good to finally meet you, Professor Monteiro. Do you think this is a great deal of progress that the concept of white supremacy is more in popular parlance? Also, it is so clear to see how morally depraved white America is with Trump worship and the boom of white nationalist movements. That is, the whiteness is nothing to strive for. Does this represent a watershed movement?
Yeah.
Does this represent a watershed moment? Was that clear?
Yeah, I think it is. No, it is a watershed moment. And, you know, in some ways, the ball is in the court of white America. You know that the only group in American society that over the last 5 years, each year shown a decline in its population are white working and poor people. You know, it's suicides, it's drug overdose, it's other things like that. But it is so severe, which is a reflection of a crisis of meaning, a crisis of consciousness. So what is the resolution to the internal crisis of whiteness? Is it Donald Trump? Not hardly. Well, frankly, it's not Joe Biden. But, and this is what Baldwin is saying, this is what King was saying, there is a way out for white people, but it is to abandon whiteness. And to abandon whiteness is to move towards blackness. Now, of course, that would engender a great cultural revolution. And I think from the Black side, we got a lot to offer to a culture for the future. We could name the names, but I won't do that right now. But I think whites must abandon whiteness in order to abandon white supremacy. And without an abandonment of whiteness and white supremacy, the white population at this moment in history will remain in a crisis and a downward spiral. There is no way out except through the abandonment of whiteness. Now, of course, that goes counter to people that say that the only way out is a socialist revolution. I put quotes around that. I would say that yes, but only on terms that the white worker must abandon whiteness. Without that abandonment, there is no socialist revolution that's possible. Last point, we talked about Bernie Sanders a lot. He's an interesting person to talk about because he was the first of a leading Democrat to be a socialist. But what kind of socialist? We talked about this yesterday. He doesn't like Venezuela, but he likes Norway. That only says to anybody that has eyes to see that he prefers socialism in a white face, socialism with whiteness rather than socialism. And for that reason, for my part, it would be good for him to abandon the stage of history and all that think like him to either reconsider or themselves they should abandon the stage of history.
Okay, the next question is from Vincent Kelly. He says, thank you for this excellent lecture, Doc. Could you talk a bit about the importance of biography in relation to philosophy? I found it very interesting how you seamlessly connected Du Bois's biography to his thought in a way that was not just anecdotal, but essential to understanding it. It seems like the traditional approach in Western philosophy has been the philosopher as individual talking about the world, but never placing him or herself within it. In postmodernism, quote, experience has in some ways taken the place of abstract discourse about the world, but in a disjointed, ahistorical way, thereby also bypassing biography. Perhaps Du Bois's own multiple autobiographical writings were another epistemic rupture within philosophy, standing in contrast with both the approaches of modern and postmodern Western thought.
Hey, man, I love what you just said, man. I really love that. And you're absolutely right. And, you know, especially, and this is a favorite of Brandon Stanford. Sometimes I think he has memorized this text by heart. Dusk of Dawn, his second autobiography, which is subtitled The Autobiography of a Race Concept, and where he says in the opening pages that his life only has significance because of its relationship to a problem, a great problem. And I would just add, his life takes on even greater significance because he addresses and tries to find solutions to this great world problem. Yeah, I agree with you. And indeed, it does transform what philosophers had been doing. Because a lot of times they were trying to act like scientists, being objective and not being emotional, engaged. But then the other thing, I just wanted to make this, the postmodern turn in philosophy and social theory. And a lot of people in this trend uphold, like, for instance, Judith Butler. But what is the difference? Remember, it's not just doing philosophy, but where do you do it from? Remember, I tried to say that Du Bois and Baldwin and King did it from the trenches, from the front of struggle and liberation, and from engagement, deep engagement with the human universe, the human situation. Doing philosophy from there and putting everything on the line. There is no guarantee you'll have a job next week. There is no guarantee you'll be alive next year. There are no guarantees. It's all sacrifice in the interest of discovering the truth, and as we say, the truth that can liberate people. You can't even begin to show or try to show equivalence between the narcissism and egotism and careerism of postmodernist academics with the likes of Baldwin. And now, just to Vincent, I just want to say, you know, think about the question of from where is philosophy done? And where do we choose to do philosophy? Because from whence we choose to do it determines how it is done. You know, the geography that you choose to think at. Is that right? Well, you know what I'm saying. The geography of the project determines the questions. And that's why Du Bois makes that, by the way, that revolutionary statement, and he makes it. The philosopher proletariat. Isn't that something? Think about that. Which then creates conditions for the vast genius and collective intelligence, especially of the Black proletariat, to come forward as the driving ideological opposition to the ideology of oppression and war. That's something to think about.
And I think I would just add that, you know, I think it's very important to emphasize that Du Bois's great contribution to this revolutionary political thought, at least in part, is going beyond its traditional boundaries.
Absolutely.
We were discussing with the depths of Dark Princess and the different philosophical and political concepts in it that he was bringing. He was transcending the bounds between philosophy and literature. And I think with the comment Vincent is making, he's also indicating how Du Bois transcended the bounds between philosophy and biography.
Absolutely.
I mean, we were discussing how he also transcended philosophy and history, but biography is bringing in his own personal history.
And you know, Baldwin does the same thing.
Right.
By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead. I just wanted to emphasize that point because you know, part of the reason we're doing this lecture series is to mark the 150th. I think it's 150th, right? Birth anniversary of VI Lenin. And while we've discussed a lot about, especially in the last session, about the importance and the contributions of Lenin and Leninism, but these contributions of Du Bois are something that are not in that body. I mean, this is something unique that Du Bois and Baldwin and King are presenting from the you know, the Afro-American civilizational perspective, one could say. And I mean, that's part of the case that we're making of why it's so important. I mean, maybe you want to say more about that.
No, just some more comments. I'd like to come back to that, though. I think you make a powerful, I mean, from your vantage point as a historian and a theorist of history, I should add.
Right. Okay, we have some more comments from Brandon Sanford says, thank you very much for that breakdown and response. Raju has a comment. He says, you talked about the concept of consciousness and souls of Black folk and its relationship to Hegel's idea of consciousness and the ability to understand the essence of the object under investigation. You also talked about how Du Bois, Baldwin, and King attached philosophy to oppress people and their freedom, and the Black proletariat in particular, but also ultimately to humanity. We started with Descartes and the importance of his pronouncement that the individual can think and hence understand. In our stage of history, could you talk about the need to attach knowledge to a creative living force, to oppress people, but also the possibility of collective knowledge rather than individual knowledge and genius?
Right. And you know, if I could just, I'll go at Raju's really statement. I don't think it's so much a question. I think it's really him putting forward a very powerful thesis that I agree with completely. Something that I did not bring up, and I just like to, in conjunction with what Raju is saying, this idea of the collective production of knowledge, the collective and shared process of discovery. You know, for example, in the free school, you know, we talk about Baldwin, King, and Du Bois. Well, we did not come to that just by osmosis. There were several years of working this out in a shared collective manner. We could not have done it alone or one without the other. This is a recognition that we don't have to be great geniuses to discover truth. It takes a certain amount of humility, a certain amount of thou-ness rather than I-ness. But yeah, I agree with Raju's thesis. The whole way we think about humanity will decide the way that we do philosophy, if that's what we want to call it. the way that we think about humanity. Now, let's just take postmodernism in the form of, let us say, Foucault. Foucault does different things with philosophical issues that are imparted to him and his generation through academics, and is pretty much he begins by acknowledging or situating his writing and thinking in a crisis. It is not the crisis of colonialism. It is not the crisis of imperialism. It is not the crisis of the color line, nor does he shift from the fundamental assumptions of white supremacy. He literally is trying to reconfigure philosophical practices within white civilization. What Du Bois and King and Baldwin and others, I'm certain, I don't want to leave anybody out, are doing is saying that not only must we reconfigure the way philosophy is practiced and some of its questions, but the whole edifice as it has evolved has to be transformed in a dialectical fashion that is the negation of the negation. We have seen, for example, that the word, maybe the concept, white supremacy, has been incorporated into philosophical discourse. But having said that, there is no evidence of a serious undermining of white supremacy in philosophical, especially academic philosophical discourse. A lot of postmodern philosophers talk about taking off from Fanon, the crisis of European reason, the crisis of European science. Well, that's good. But there is not a recognition that to discover the truth in this crisis, it must be predicated or grounded in an ongoing and intensifying struggle. People say, well, we don't have a big movement like King and those have. Well, that's all right. There's still ways to wage the struggle. And the academy, as sad as it is for those who are locked in it, is the worst place to try to seek the truth.
Right, we have some more comments. One sec. Okay, Jamila Wilson says, the philosopher proletariat supersedes the importance and value of the philosopher king from Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point.
Yes, I think it's a highly important. It is the opposite.
Right. Meghna has a comment. She says, the price of the ticket that the authority to speak comes from one's willingness to sacrifice is such a powerful concept, especially when applied to philosophy.
Yes.
You have shown us how philosophy, whether it is Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Lenin, or Du Bois and Baldwin, emerges and must be understood in the context of a struggle for freedom and a willingness to sacrifice for ideas, in contrast to how academics teach philosophy, where they pick apart text unmoored from this context. Would you say that the ideas that stand the test of time can be separated from the ideas that fall into the dustbin of history by whether or not the philosophers themselves are willing to pay the price of the ticket?
I agree with it. I agree. Hey, Joe, you remember when you and Meghna came over to my crib that day? My crib, my house, and you all said, we want to study Lenin. Remember that? And I was hesitant, right? And I said, I can't tell you not to. And I really didn't want to tell you not to. And I'm not going to tell you not to. But because I had read so much of it. But I said, I think I tried to say, I don't know if I said it exactly this way. The pressing issues of this moment, of our time, of your time, are not addressed in Lenin. And I say that not to put Lenin down, because he and his colleagues and comrades addressed the crisis of their time with courage and commitment. Can't take that away. And part of the reason that Lenin is not taught as philosophy is because he abandoned the academic and university and quietist manner of doing philosophy and became an active participant in making history and making philosophy. But I said that at this time, because, and it was my perception, because we had moved to a new moment where the great obstacle, I forget who made this comment, where the color line is over-determining, we had to move to a investigation, interrogation, and application of those thinkers that recognize the over-determining character of the color line, that whiteness is the great obstacle to white folk joining the darker races, that whiteness is a destructive force in terms of consciousness, identity, behavior, and practice. You can't do much with people who embrace that. They become viruses. They become destructive to themselves and everything around them. But that's not in Lenin, sadly. For them to carry out the revolution in Russia, they could do it without this thinking, without a Baldwin, without a Du Bois. You know what I'm saying? They could do it without them. But we cannot move forward without them. And I guess that's what I'm saying to Magna. The price of the ticket, that's Baldwin. The price of the ticket is sacrifice on the front of struggle. Without that, you're just another academic trying to make a career and trying to get paid, you know? I don't know, that was such a central moment for me. I never forgot it. I don't know whether you remember it like I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've been saying, in terms of the price of the ticket,
Yes.
we're acknowledging the price paid by Lenin and his colleagues and the importance of the Russian Revolution, but in a scientific manner, we're trying to build on top of and beyond their contributions.
Yes.
And I think the process, as you're saying, we've been working together in the Free School. We've identified the constellation of thinkers who are we feel are relevant for our time, and especially relevant to what we have identified as the agents of revolutionary change in our time. And in that, we have to move beyond the ideas that were in vogue 100 years ago and in a different sort of historical era. But I mean, nonetheless, as we've said, we still see the importance of some.
And we're dedicating these conversations to Lenin.
Right.
He is a huge figure. But history moves on, and knowledge has to be advanced. We're not dogmatists. Right. We're not sectarian. We're committed to a grand synthesis of ideas. But, you know, I've always felt that because so much of revolutionary thought has been bound to the European Enlightenment, it is difficult to separate the revolutionary theory from the backwardness that comes with the European Enlightenment. I mean, even Marx says that they wanted to turn Hegel on his head and make him into a materialist rather than an idealist. Well, there was a lot more to have to empty Hegel's philosophy of, including white supremacy. Mm-hmm. But they didn't see it as a problem because they saw Europe in much the same way that that Hegel or Kant saw Europe. And that was a blindness. And I guess that's why I'm so impressed with the imaginative and courageous way that Du Bois went about doing philosophy, and how enormous that heritage is for us. I mean, I don't know about you. I think I could speak for you on this. We couldn't be sane in this complicated world, being people who feel and think and want things to change. We would go insane without this framework that we're establishing. We'd go insane. We'd be so depressed, so alienated, you know? And that's what I think that's so important.
Yeah, and I mean that's the essence of why we've been doing this work is especially the events that we're seeing now, the effect, mental, spiritual, economic, political that it's having on the masses of people. There has to be some ideological framework or vision that helps them make sense of these things and find an optimism.
I agree with you.
So we have another comment from Colin Clement. He says, "Thanks, Doc. Vincent's comment reminds me also of the introduction to Gandhi's autobiography. He says his friends criticize his choice to write an autobiography as being, quote, Western, but he retorts that he's simply telling his own history of his experiments with truth, which is the subtitle of this book."
Right.
Nzinga Reed says, "Wow, I needed this intellectual stimulation. Break it down, Doc."
Break it down.
Jeremiah Kim says, "Hi, Doc. Thank you for this amazing lecture. Could you speak on the difference between Du Bois's concept of the proletarian philosopher versus Antonio Gramsci's concept of the organic intellectual? I ask because I've often seen university academics bring up Gramsci as a way to cover for their ideology of identity politics and their own comfortable position within the university, where they don't have to engage in any kind of struggle for freedom."
I think, I don't, when you take a person like Gramsci, I would be the last person to belittle his contribution and his sacrifice. But that doesn't mean that that he got a lot of things right. And I think this question, which is the question that Gramsci is often identified, the question of the intelligentsia and the revolutionary intelligentsia as a central part of the intelligentsia as a whole. So I think his the way that he deals with the problem of the intelligentsia, even though he calls for the intelligentsia to be organic to the working class, and that seems almost like what Du Bois is saying: those who work must be thinkers, and those who think must work. So kind of an interesting thing, because Du Bois develops a two-sidedness. Not only must the thinker work, but those who think must work. I think in The Dark Princess, the two main characters, Matthew Towns and Princess Catilia, stand out as people, and this is not in Gramsci, but it's Du Bois and in Baldwin, who make a moral choice to sacrifice, to do what is not normal for intellectuals. And I think, maybe I'm wrong, but as I've read Gramsci, he sees the organic intellectual as the intellectual who speaks for the working class, but is not necessarily a worker. Going forward, we see that most Gramscian thinkers are academics. But in the Du Boisian construal, and of course, side by side with Baldwin, it is a demonstrated choice. And as Baldwin put, it's the price of the ticket. You know, it is the price of the ticket. And I don't think Gramsci has that. It is a structural dimension. He's hypothesizing how out of the entire intelligentsia, including government workers and academics, comes a part of the intelligentsia who will speak on behalf of, write on behalf of the working class. You know, you could take Jacobin magazine as an example of the organic intellectual who is a self-identified revolutionary, quote unquote. But that's not what Du Bois is talking about. And that's not how he lived his life.
Right. We have another comment from Al-Fatih Moho Abdullah. I'm kind of interpreting this, so if you're listening, if you can just make sure I'm getting it right. Yuval Noah Harari said, revolutionary knowledge doesn't get the chance to be at the center of power because the center is built on solid preconceptions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was clear, but I think he's quoting something.
No, it's very clear. I mean, yeah. Right. I mean, my dear brother, you know, Du Bois wrote an essay, I wanted to reference it here, called, and matter of fact, it was a presentation, an address that he gave on the 50th anniversary of his graduation from Fisk University, 1938. And it's called The Prophecy of Saint Org, the Prophecy of Saint Org the Damned. Now, Saint Org, people say, well, who was Saint Org? I never heard of that saint. Well, it's a mythological figure, and Org is the word Negro spelled backwards. So the prophecy of the Negroes, you know, the damned. I say that to say no, truth is always on the scaffold, wrong is always on the throne, but it is the scaffold that sways the future. James Russell Lowell. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends to justice. That's the faith. That's the optimism of the freedom fighter. But the freedom fighter does not imagine, nor does she or he want to imagine, ever being at the center of power that dispenses injustice to the people. Well, I guess you got some people claiming to be socialists who want to be there. But no, he's right. I agree with him. The revolutionary intellectual was always damned and to the margins, but she or he always stands with history and with truth.
And we've also seen in situations when revolutionaries or revolutionary intellectuals do come to power, even then they face the same challenges, consequences. And on that point, there's a comment by Rowan Fraser who says, Jacobin magazine questioned Thomas Sankara's revolutionary ambitions in an article by Harsh in ways that sanctioned the coup against him in Burkina Faso. Well, I didn't know that, but
I didn't know that either.
That's an example, I guess. Of
yeah.
Coming to power,
but they're organic intellectuals, right?
Yeah. We have a comment by Grady Lights. He says, what about the spiritual and psychological attributes, profile, if you will, of the actor who engages the white worker to persuade him or her to abandon whiteness and can withstand the racist-based resistance, the messenger as well as the message? The rhetorical, discursive force required arguably transcends philosophical knowledge. For the efficient cause of the white workers' abandonment of whiteness will be a Du Boisian trialectic in which the conversants see themselves each playing devil's advocate with their positions.
Yeah, I would say what Grady, and how you Grady, what Grady is suggesting is a part of a more comprehensive struggle, which will be from without whiteness, from the outside of the white world, and from within. And he is suggesting a pedagogy that of a long process of undoing through discourse the assumptions that identify people as white and identify whiteness as normal and natural. And the other thing, identifying whiteness as a biological trait or a natural trait. It will be a long struggle. Even if progressive and radical forces took power in the United States, that would just be the beginning of a long struggle of undoing centuries of wrongness, of evilness. Yes, I agree with Grady. And then, of course, one of the major, and this is Martin Luther King, one of the major foundations of white supremacy and whiteness is the religious institutions and religious thought. Theology upholds white supremacy. And of course, that's why, Howard Thurman said his Jesus is the Jesus of the oppressed. Now, the question on the other side of the color line is, well, who is your Jesus? And does your Jesus change, I'm talking about white folk, when whiteness goes into crisis? And do you seek another Jesus? Might the Jesus of the oppressed be your Jesus as well? And then from a more elevated spiritual thing, I think that for most people who are locked into whiteness, I don't think, as has happened at times of crisis, that the way out is to then take up Hinduism or Buddhism in a uniquely Western form. I think it is to struggle with what you have come to this point with, and that is Christianity. Don't abandon it. Find a way to radicalize and revolutionize it as an instrument of freedom. And the roadmap is kind of there with King and Howard Thurman and others.
Right. That's an interesting analysis of these new age religious tendencies. Almost escapism from society at times.
Yeah.
But
Hinduism on LSD.
right. That's a whole other discussion.
Well, we get to that another.
Yeah. Nandita has a comment. I really appreciate how this series has allowed us to look at the thinkers of the European Enlightenment, although they are not the thinkers that explain our present or the future, because I believe it is important how people in the past thought in revolutionary ways, or ways that at least challenge the norm, and what separates those ideas from what is required now in a world defined by the color line. Similarly, I find learning about Marx, Lenin, and others is important to understand their shortcomings and deficiencies. Thanks a lot to Dr. Monteiro for preparing this narrative and history for these presentations.
And I have to say to Nandita, I wish I could have done more, and it's that I don't know enough. I wish I knew more about all of the reform movements within Hinduism and Buddhism and the class struggle and ideological struggle over time in India. I don't know enough about Chinese ideological struggles. I'm not talking about just Maoism, but I wish I knew more, because really in talking about the Enlightenment and modern philosophy, as it were, we are talking essentially about Europe, the smallest part of the world, geographically and population-wise. But then, my justification or rationalization is that Europe became the hegemon. The modern empires were pretty much all European, and colonialism was the ultimate globalization. And so you had to talk about it because I don't know that they were speaking English in India before Britain came there, or in Nigeria or Ghana for that matter, or that they were necessarily, the indigenous people were speaking Spanish in Cuba or French in Haiti, you know what I'm saying? But we are, I guess, we are bound by the verdict of history. And we can't, because we don't like history or like the way history has gone, we can't ignore it and in a utopian way, go back to something earlier. So that's why we have to, but I wish I knew more, I'll tell you the truth.
Right. Well, anyway, in this series, I think we began the process of examining Western philosophy. And of course, I think we'll continue with our study of Western philosophy, but as you said, also look at other perspectives on philosophy. We have a question from Nzinga Reed. She says, how do you explain white supremacy to young people? Lately, I have been talking to young people in the age group of 17, 19, 22 years old.
Well, I think you're talking to Black young people. Well, I think Vincent mentioned biography. I think in Nzinga, we can teach by telling our own stories. A lot goes on in the free school, and we older people in the free school, we're always telling stories. Grady, the man that you may have heard pose a question or statement earlier, he's a Gullah. He's from the Gullah people of South Carolina. And there's stories that he can tell that, I learn about white supremacy and racism and discrimination, but he tells it from the South. There's stories that Munchie, Hugh Moore, tells, and he tells it from working on the shipyards. Yvonne King, so we tell stories because this is, and I agree with, this is where I agree with Vincent very strongly. The biographical form is a way to introduce the living human being into the thing which you're trying to explain. So if you tell your story, what it was like going to school, how there were teachers who were particularly mean and difficult to Black students. You know, I often think about, you know, my grandchildren. How do I explain these things to them? And I guess, you know, to share my life with them is what I would try to do. And yeah, share. That's, I'm sorry.
Well, we've made it to 4:17. Jamila Wilson says, "Great work as always. You can lay your burdens for now. Lay your burdens down for now." Thank you, Tony. Maybe it's time to heed her suggestion. But I mean, I would just like to conclude.
Say something about Sun Ra.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. We promised that we have to talk a little bit about Sun Ra before we lay our burdens down.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Sun Ra. A lot of people are interested in Sun Ra, but also John and Alice Coltrane and many more, Don Cherry, who you could almost put in that category of King's My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, my pilgrimage away from Western philosophy and religion. But Sun Ra was really unique. Sun Ra comes out of both the Fletcher Henderson orchestra and is heavily influenced by Duke Ellington. Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington are the earliest exemplars of the orchestral form of the blues and of jazz. And so Sun Ra, although as he evolved, he took on a performative style, which many people would say was outlandish. But musically and compositionally, in many ways, he's very traditional. You might even say very Ellingtonian, very Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington has a huge imprint on jazz, and such figures as Thelonious Monk and Charlie Mingus, and then Sun Ra fall within that Ellington orchestral style. But Sun Ra is distinguished not only because of the variations and multiple styles within his music, and he does it all, and he does it all well. Does avant-garde and free jazz as well as traditional jazz. But it is his philosophy. And I'm still trying to work it out and understand it. It is not outlandish. It defines the way he does music and the way he composes music. And his ultimate foundational concept is the concept of infinity. In other words, he thinks about the world that we live from the standpoint of other worlds. I mean, it's so extraordinary. I mean, the practice of it, I'm still trying to understand. But to think of this world from the standpoint of other worlds that I would argue maybe are imaginative worlds. So to think of the finite from the infinite. But then there is another piece to Sun Ra, and that is the infinite, the finite, that sound, even, sounds that we're conscious of, he argues, in effect, that much of the sound that we are conscious of and even not conscious of comes from vibrations billions of years ago. And only recently or in our time have reached us. And in a sense, he is trying to understand those universes, and he sees a multi-universe, and the sounds that are produced there. Now, of course, that's not all that different from people like John Coltrane and Alice Coltrane and Pharaoh Sanders, because they are projecting sounds that don't make all that much sense from the standpoint of ordinary life. In fact, they disrupt ordinary life. That's what Sun Ra is saying. And he's also making a claim, I think he's pessimistic about humanity. And he says that man has messed up the world. And so why should we authorize those who have not done well in this world to guide us to an understanding of other worlds? And he also makes the claim, he has this composition, God is greater than love will ever be. So interesting. Somebody would say, well, God is love. I don't know if Sun Ra will agree with that. But then Sun Ra is heavily Egyptology, that Egypt is the original great civilization, that all that has proceeded since Egypt has fallen short of what the potential that Egypt was. But I think Sun Ra, this idea of thinking about this world from other worlds, might be more common sense today than it was when he was first talking about it. But then to produce orchestral and other forms of music that are in line with that. And of course, I hear some things like that in John Coltrane, in Pharaoh Sanders, in Alice. Alice Coltrane's use of the harp is to capture different sounds. Roland Kirk invents instruments and plays several reed instruments at the same time, almost to go beyond this world and to communicate or to embrace sounds that would not normally find their place into music. So that's what I would say about Sun Ra. He is an extraordinary figure. Some days I'll say that he is the most important composer of the 20th century. Some people say, well, what about Ellington? I say, well, I'm putting him over Ellington. On other days, I'll say that he and Ellington are equal. I would say these things about Sun Ra because of the magnitude of his production. There's no composer, musician in any genre that has produced so much recorded music. Now, one thing Sun Ra did, he taped and pressed his own records. So he wasn't waiting for a record company to say, oh, wow, we want you to make an album. But he has produced more music, and all very, very good music. So I think that he and Ellington are equals, and that he is one of the greatest composers of the 20th century, and really of the avant-garde, post-classical music. And that's for one reason, he's more recognized and appreciated in Europe, where classical music is still, very important, than he is in the United States. But that's what I would say about Sun Ra. Maybe one day we'll have a chance to do a conversation about philosophy and music.
Yeah, so I think over these 4 lectures, we've covered as much as we could, given time and everything else. But of course, I think it's fair to say that we're leaving people with a lot of things that they'll be thinking about, a lot of questions that they'll be striving to solve. And I would just like to say to our viewers that I hope that you'll continue to join us as long as this coronavirus is going on. We'll be doing live streams of the Saturday Free School every Saturday starting at 10 a.m. If you haven't seen the previous lectures of this series, they'll be on Facebook, on the Saturday Free School Facebook page. We're also putting them on YouTube under the channel Free School Media, where you could also find a number of our previous conferences and other programs that we've put on. And I would like to thank you for joining us in this series. I would like to thank Dr. Monteiro for his hard work in preparing them. And I'd like to turn it over to you if you have any parting comments you'd like to share.
I think I've talked enough. I just want to thank you, man, and thank people for listening. And maybe, just maybe, we will find a way to resume these philosophy discussions. Because I think now that we've gotten beyond much of the modern European philosophy, I think we do have to do a little bit more with Baldwin and Du Bois and King. I didn't do enough. Because we have to think about the futuristic part of this whole endeavor. So we'll see.
Right. So, I mean, as with everything we do, it's to be continued.
Yes.
Because we're very present and future-centered people. So I would just ask everyone to stay tuned to the Saturday Free School Facebook page for updates. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.